Welcome to episode 76 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's May 2026. Otsukare-sama deshita. We made it. I've got what I think is an interesting, if language light, newsletter for you all this month, and a great recommendation. But let me start with an apology. I don't think I fully wrapped up my thoughts on my recommendation in the podcast last month. If you didn't listen, I recommended the fresh noodles at Japanese grocery stores, specifically the udon for breakfast, the kind of bagged noodles that are ready to go. All you have to do is drop them in hot water, boiling water for about 2 minutes, and they're good to go. But you can use them not just for udon for breakfast, you can use them for like stir fries and ramens and things like that. And so my recommendation was these bagged noodles specifically, especially given how cheap they are, and they are cheap. If you go to Gyomu Super, you can get a bag of udon for 18 yen, which doesn't even feel like possible. Like that must be some kind of, they must be losing money by selling udon for 18 yen a bag. I feel like it costs more just to drive it to the store these days. And knowing my luck, that probably will lead to a price increase, I think, over the next month or so. Everybody's saying that the prices are going to start going up in June. We'll see if that happens. 18 yen udon also gives me the opportunity to reference a Mitch Hedberg joke, which is prices like 18 yen for a bag of udon makes you think you're going to sell udon, like buy bags at Gyomu Super and then go like sell them on the street somewhere. Mitch Hedberg's joke is that when he sees pop, he calls it pop because he's from the Midwest, for like 25 cents a can at somewhere like Costco, that makes him think he's going to go sell pop, which you probably could do in America. But bagged udon, I don't think the resale rate for that probably pretty low, but still funny thing to think about. My larger point that I forgot to kind of like tie in a bow at the end of the podcast was that you should be exploring Japanese supermarkets. There are a lot of great options, and you might be limiting yourself from accessing them just because they seem weird or different or even new. Or maybe you just haven't even like walked down that aisle of the grocery store. So for me, this was fresh noodles. It might be something totally different for you. If you're living here in Japan, have a look and see what else is on the shelves. We recently started keeping a frozen meal or two on hand for days when things get crazy. One of the nicer supermarkets here in Osaka has these frozen meals, and they really aren't that expensive, just 700 yen for an entree that will feed 2 people more or less, really depending on the entree. To give you an example, one is frozen slices of salmon with butter, shoyu sauce, and some vegetables. All you have to do is thaw them out, cook them in a skillet with a little bit of oil, and serve with rice, and you have a nice little meal. I'd be curious to know what supermarket finds you all have found that have surprised you in Japan. Or maybe there's something that you initially avoided and then has now become a staple in your diet. If there's anything like that, email me at howtojapanese@gmail.com. I'd love to hear about it. And now for the newsletter this month. I mentioned that it's a bit language light, and that's due to the fact that I decided it's time to say something about generative AI. I think of this month's newsletter as a warning to avoid AI at all costs if you are just starting to learn Japanese. I did a little digging, and unfortunately, a lot of the literature I'm seeing right now is making a lot of pretty extreme claims about AI and language learning, that it can help correct student grammar errors, that can even serve as a conversation partner. And I have no doubt that it can do some of these things to a certain extent, although I can't speak to how well it can do them because I haven't really used it all that much. To give you a quick overview of how I've used AI or my interaction with AIs to this point, ChatGPT launched in November 2022, and I paid it no attention at all until a close friend from home sent me a prompt and told me to enter it without looking and then to play through the role-playing scenario he had kind of like programmed into ChatGPT with the prompt. So I humored him, and it was an interesting little experiment. It kind of turned into a loose approximation of a tabletop role-playing experience that we had grown up with, but it didn't end. Obviously, the prompt that my friend had created was pretty simple and straightforward, but after kind of like talking through it and walking through the scenario a little bit, it didn't really ever go anywhere, and I just kind of like gave up on ChatGPT in general. The next time I used it was the summer of 2023 after Murakami's novel came out in Japanese, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. So I read the book and I started looking for reviews in Japanese, but I couldn't find any that felt like definitive, that felt like what I was used to seeing an English language literature review. There was some commentary. It all felt like kind of wishy-washy and celebratory. And most of them were in actual literary journals, so I couldn't like do anything with them in terms of like putting the text through an AI. And it never really occurred to me until I did find one that was digital, and I said, well, let me see what an AI can make of this. And so I pasted it in ChatGPT and asked for a summary, and the summary was okay. It was not bad. And then I asked if it was a positive or negative review, and I was able to detect what I was seeing, which was that the review was neither positive nor negative, at least not explicitly. More than anything, the reviewer was just kind of spinning their wheels, wrestling with the ideas in the novel rather than saying whether those ideas were worth wrestling with in the first place. I think sometimes, unfortunately, they are not, and definitely not in the case of that Murakami book. And that's really the extent of my usage. I did some casual querying that summer and was able to kind of confirm a WordPress error that I'd had trouble with and solve thanks to somebody on Reddit. I wanted to kind of see whether ChatGPT was able to solve it, and it did impressively. I put basically, so I had already fixed it at that point myself, but I pasted in the error message, and without any kind of additional information at all, ChatGPT was able to solve it. So I do think with coding, I don't know, there's some interesting things going on there. But I haven't really been interested in using it all that much. I organized a series of 3 talks for SWET, the Society of Writers, Editors, and Translators, on AI, about what is AI. That was the first talk. The second talk was about some translators incorporating it into their workflow and what that looks like for an individual, what that looks like for a company. And then we had a third presentation, and I gave a presentation on the dangers of AI, notably the environmental dangers, ethical and moral dangers. And we had one other person give a talk on the risks of algorithms in public administration. Pretty interesting talk. I would definitely recommend going to look at those. In the last year, however, AI, I think, has reached a fever point, and I felt like I had to say something in terms of language learning, mostly so students can understand what I think is the threat to their own language abilities. And I will admit that I think the threat is largest to those just starting their studies and people who are kind of at the early stages, people who haven't reached what I would call functional fluency, where you feel more or less comfortable in the language, even if you may be a little rusty here and there. I think those people are the ones who are most at risk for AI, but also most likely to turn to AI. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, and I wanted to write a little bit about that in the newsletter. AI will not help you learn a language, and I feel like unless you're extremely careful with your usage, it will only undermine your ability to learn the language. To understand this, I think you first need to understand that learning a language is, at a very fundamental level, an unending process of failure. You start with 0 and you gradually work your way to something, and only by trying and failing, being gently correcting yourself, will you ever learn anything. If you reduce any of that friction, you slow down the learning process. If you reduce that failure, unfortunately, you slow down the learning process. And I think the main goal of AI is to reduce that friction. I wrote about an experience I had in high school in the newsletter in my AP Spanish class. One of my classmates started this kind of competition with me that I had never really asked for. It was just kind of fun and games. He always did a few points better than me on the take-home essays that we had for the class. But then I ended up doing better than him on the in-class essays, where they were time limited and we weren't allowed to kind of like look up anything. this stuck with me, I think, over the years. This happened, over probably close to not quite 30 years, but almost 30 years ago. And it stuck with me because I think it's emblematic of two different types of language learning, and that is scripted language and improvisational language. You need both to eventually learn to be fluent. You need to script out your first few lessons and sentences as you start from zero, and then you can make some attempts at using those scripted phrases improvisationally to kind of seal them in your active vocabulary. You could, I guess, theoretically go straight to improvisational language if you just, from zero, knowing nothing, flew straight to Japan and just started kind of like bumping into the language. But you'd be failing a lot more at first, and I think you'd really be forced to pick up on what you can contextually in a way that you wouldn't be if you start from kind of these scripted phrases, which is what some textbooks like Japanese, the spoken language, do, where they give you a set of maybe like 10, 20 sentences for each lesson that you are supposed to kind of memorize, script out essentially at first. And I guess if you think about it, before we had textbooks, people were really only able to learn languages improvisationally way back in the day. There was no AI back then, nothing to reduce that friction. And anytime I think you get tempted to reduce that friction yourself by using AI, I think you should do the opposite and seek out the pain instead, because there is pain in language learning. It is not fun a lot of the time. You are failing, you are getting embarrassed, you are getting laughed at, you are sounding strange. I think even once you get to functional fluency, I know that I'm making a fool of myself. One good example is I was talking to my wife about our daughter, and I was talking about how her wet diapers were feeling like heavier recently, especially after in the morning. And so I said "nyo no ryo," which to me was a funny phrase because the amount of urine, "nyo" is urine in Japanese, "ryo" is amount, and those probably sound the same to listeners because my pronunciation is terrible. But "nyo" nyo with a long vowel, "ryo" ryo with a long vowel. And my wife kind of laughed at the joke, but then said, "Oh yeah, but you don't need to say nyo, you can just say oshikko." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense because it's the casual way to say pee instead of urine." So that's just an example of one of my recent kind of failures, friction points that I will now never, ever, I think, forget. And those are the moments you lose when you have AI do the language. So again, seek out the pain, seek out pause, literally when you are considering doing something like using AI, pause, take a moment to acknowledge, okay, why is it that I'm turning to this tool? Is it because what I'm doing is painful right now? Maybe I'm not having fun with this studying. Maybe I'm tired, or it's just not fun what I'm doing. Maybe it just sucks in some way. And you should say, okay, that's true, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is what I have to do before I read an email or a chat message 3 or 4 times before finally understanding it. Like if I'm struggling with something and I'm tempted to throw it in an AI chatbot, I resist that and I say, okay, let's go read it again. Let's lean into that discomfort and do it again until I get it. And again, this is what I do when I have to look up a phrase to make sure I'm using it correctly. This is what I do when I'm doing a translation and run into a word that I don't understand, which is one of the most frustrating parts of translation, because the fun part of translation is actually doing the language. And then if you don't understand something, you can't do the fun part, and then it throws me off and I get distracted. This is what I do when I'm tired and I just want to relax, but I know I need to get a few pages ahead in the Murakami novella that I'm reading so that I can review it. By pushing yourself, by resisting the urge to reduce that friction and pain, you're maintaining the virtuous cycle between scripted and improvisational language. Your improvisational language is initially supplied by that reservoir of scripted language that you've built up, by those kind of set phrases you learned initially. And you also refill that reservoir with on the spot interactions, watching TV, encountering language out in the wild, things you read, things like that. AI cuts the connection on both sides of the equation. If you use an app to translate an email that you'd write at home or to draft a self introduction, you're missing out on opportunities to build up that reservoir with scripted phrases. And then if you use an app to interpret a conversation at town hall, or if you're out at a bar and need help understanding somebody, then you're missing opportunities to refill that reservoir with conversations out in the wild. My challenge to students, especially new students, is to commit to studying Japanese for 3 years at the very least without using any AI whatsoever. I think 3 years, especially if you are in a college course, is a decent enough point to give you a foundation that would be like reasonably strong, so that an AI may not like totally destroy it. And then, in other words, you're not building up this illusion of fluency through using an AI. If by 3 years if you avoid it for 3 years and you kind of build that foundation on your own instead. And then at that point, at 3 years, I think you can kind of make your own decision. You'll be hopefully equipped enough to make a decision on whether that's something you want to incorporate into your language study. And then I'd say, see if you can go even longer than that. Why stop if you've already kind of grown comfortable with that necessary pain of language learning? That's what I had in the newsletter this month. My recommendation, as promised, is a very specific travel recommendation. It is Sukayu Onsen in Aomori Prefecture. When I was first on the JET program, I was deep in the countryside in Fukushima Prefecture, which is the southernmost prefecture in the Tohoku region. I had a car and drove all over the place, mostly up to Sendai for the JLPT and over to Niigata on the occasional day trip. But I also spent a lot of time climbing mountains in Yamagata. For spring break one year, I drove all the way up to Aomori to see the city and to drive the Shimokita Peninsula. You're probably hearing my daughter in the background, so I have to ignore that, please. So my trip was great, and I'm sure I must have mentioned the amazing art museum in Aomori at one point. It's one of my absolute favorites in Japan. Definitely worth a visit. Very modern, some really like amazing giant rooms, and they had these amazing Chagall kind of murals on display when I went. I knew another CIR on the JET program in Aomori, and I had messaged him to ask about onsen recommendations that he had, and he pointed me towards Sukayu Onsen. So without much research other than that, I booked a night for me and my girlfriend at the time, and we stayed there. Sukayu is at the base of Hakoda-san, which is a mountain, I think probably about an hour or so outside of Aomori City, and it has great snowboarding in the winter, and I would imagine good hiking in the summer. We went at the tail end of snowboarding season and were able to spend a day on the slopes before heading to the ryokan. The rooms themselves are only fine, kind of bare bones Japanese rooms. And the highlight really is the baths themselves. They have what is called a 1,000-person bath, a giant room that has co-ed bathing, although at the time, even back in 2007, it wasn't fully co-ed. They split the large room in half, and men and women could only access like one half of it. But the giant bath in there was one that you could kind of like, you could share, and you could go sit right next to each other with a rope separating you. The water is, as the name of the onsen implies, very sour and tangy. Like the most kind of, other than Yufuin in Oita Prefecture, it was the most impressive water to me. And I don't know what that's due to, so whatever minerals are in the water there, but it was, I think, probably top 5 water that I've had at an onsen in Japan. Yeah, the top one being in Yufuin for sure. It's an amazing ryokan, and my only regret is that when I went, I was a cheapskate at the time, and I only did sudomari. Sudomari is a combination of the su from sunao and also shiroto, and also so and sozai. It's the character that gets used there. And domari is from tomari or tomaru, and so putting them together means simply staying. It's when you stay at a ryokan without any meals, which is generally a huge mistake since the meals are kind of part of the attraction. And at Tsukayu Onsen, it's not like there's any restaurants within walking distance or things like that. So, okay, yeah, you can definitely hear my daughter in the background. So yeah, she's just playing on her little mat with some toys. So you're just gonna have to put up with that, I think, for the next who knows how long. So thank you, listeners. All maybe 100 of you. We'll see. I think that's how many we've got at this point. But the rooms we went, as I mentioned, were kind of like pleasantly run down but clean and well kept. And so I imagine the food wasn't like stellar. Like I've been to Arima Onsen, which has some really excellent food at the onsen that I've stayed there. But I think that it definitely would have been better than whatever we lugged with us from the closest convenience store, which was, I think, probably one of the worst decisions I've made living in Japan. If you do, however, only need room and not board when you're staying somewhere in Japan, other than sudomari, the other way to express this is to say shukuhaku nomi. Shukuhaku is literally the act of staying at the ryokan, and nomi being only. So that's my recommendation, Tsukayu Onsen. I would also definitely recommend driving around that area. If you drive south, there's Lake Towada. It's a beautiful lake. And if you go in the winter, the roads there have several meters of snow piled up. And we went in late March during spring break. So fortunately, the roads were clear, but they were still piled, like, I think probably like 4 meters high with snow. So it was like driving in a tunnel. It was absolutely incredible. So I would definitely recommend that, which reminds me that I need to switch my US license over to a Japanese license. And I regret not doing it sooner because they just made the testing much more strict because of the current administration's policy towards immigrants. I won't get into that in too much detail, but I'll just say that when I switched my license over living on Jet, it failed 3 times, and I imagine it's going to take more failures than that this time. I guess that's the lesson this month. Maybe that failure is something you have to go through to earn something sometimes. And that's about it. That's all I've got for you. I've got one link. I got a link to the blog post in the newsletter, as well as a link to an article on trans fats from the Ministry of Agriculture, which I thought was a really interesting read. Very like simple, straightforward, nice images that help explain the concepts that they're explaining. So a really interesting way to like learn Japanese and also something else through reading it in Japanese. Yeah. And then also one other note is that I think going forward in even months, I'm going to kind of send out a shorter form of the newsletter. I think what I'll be doing is like looking through my archives of my blog and then digging into a topic that I've written about previously or introducing ideas that I've already talked about on the blog years and years ago, but I can refresh for the newsletter. Just need to buy a little bit of time to work on some other writing projects. And I'm kind of like short on time at the moment. One of those being the Murakami review that I'm working on of his novellas. I've got about a little bit less than 20 pages left in the last novella. And so hopefully you're going to have something about that before too long. And I can give you a little sneak preview at this point, and I'll say it's not very good. So nothing new from Murakami at this point. I think his best days are past him, unfortunately. But we shall see. Maybe he can wrap it all up, tie it all together, make something of it in the last 15 pages. We'll see. Okay, hope you all have a good month. Stay cool. Enjoy the last of the nice weather before we get hot in June.